As Oldsmobile was busy redefining its image in an attempt to get back to its former glory, it didn't quite get everything right. There was one thing missing from their centennial plan, something that should have been glaringly obvious. I've covered several mistakes and missed opportunities in my Oldsmobile video series, but today I want to focus on what I think was their biggest blunder, something that most people overlook when talking about Oldsmobile's demise. In the 1980s, Oldsmobile was one of the most popular car makers in the US market. Their Cutlass Supreme was the country's best-selling model. Another Cutlass, the Sierra, was also quite popular, especially with fleet buyers. It was a cousin to the Buick Century, sharing the GM A platform. The Cutlass Sierra became Oldsmobile's best-selling model, even down to its last production year. In fact, GM wanted to replace all the A-body models with the new mid-size W-body cars, but the Oldsmobile and Buick versions were so popular, GM basically had no choice but to keep making them. Only the Chevrolet Celebrity and Pontiac 6000 got replaced on schedule, by the Lumina and Grand Prix sedans respectively. However, new side impact standards would come into effect for 1997, and the A-body wasn't quite up to the task. And after 14 years, the platform was getting along in the tooth anyway. So in 1996, the Sierra and Century lines came to an end. What would Buick and Olds do now? Here's where it gets interesting. Buick had originally intended to replace the Century with the new Regal sedan. Now that they had to stop making the A platform, would they try to do that again? Surprisingly, no. They developed another generation of Century on the W platform, the same one as the Regal. And as you'd expect, the two cars were similar. But why would they do that? Well, Buick recognised that their customers wanted a car that was simple, comfortable, and traditional. The new Century had fairly nondescript styling, but that was the whole point. Buick wanted to avoid styling trends that would go out of fashion and make the Century age poorly. The existing Regal was available with the 3.1-litre 60-degree V6 or the famous 3800. For the new generation, the engine choices would be split. The Century would get the 3.1 just like the previous generation, while the new Regal would get the 3800. That made the lineup simple. Also, the new Century was only offered with a bench seat, while the Regal got bucket seats. It sold well, and it even lasted a year longer than the Regal. Sure, it was plain and basic, but at least Buick knew what they were doing. They effectively integrated the Century into the Regal lineup without replacing it altogether, so they carried on the sales success that the older Century had. Oldsmobile, for their part, did none of that. The Sierra had been their best-selling model right up to its final year, even though it looked very old-fashioned. Now that Oldsmobile couldn't make the Cutlass Sierra anymore, what would they do? In a word, nothing. While Buick had a clear strategy to make the most of a best-selling product, Oldsmobile focused on making a new generation of vehicles in an effort to redefine the brand's image, and completely overlooked their own best-selling model in the process. So when they discontinued the Cutlass Sierra, they did nothing to carry on the success afterwards. Okay, technically they didn't do absolutely nothing. They just threw a lazily rebadged Chevy Malibu onto the market and hoped that people would wait a few years and buy an Alero. This was probably Oldsmobile's biggest blunder. It all has to do with the kind of cars that the Sierra and Alero were. Imagine telling a Toyota Camry buyer to wait a few years and then get a Honda Civic Type R instead. That's basically what Oldsmobile expected from its customers by trying to replace the Sierra with the Alero. The Alero was meant to replace the Achiever, a sporty compact on the N platform, carrying on the lineage started by the Cutlass Calais. The Calais and Achiever were sold alongside the Cutlass Sierra during their production runs, because they targeted completely different market segments. Someone who wanted to buy a Sierra was unlikely to look at an Achiever. With the Sierra gone, that customer probably wouldn't have considered buying an Alero. In fact, they'd be more likely to look at the new Buick Century instead. And the worst part about all this is that Oldsmobile almost got it right. The Malibu-based Cutlass had the potential to be the new Sierra and appeal to the same buyers. The 1997 Chevrolet Malibu was also built on the N platform, like the Oldsmobile Alero and Pontiac Grand Am. However, the Malibu was a bigger car. While all three had the same wheelbase, the Alero and Grand Am were compact, but the Malibu was closer to midsize. And so, the N-body Cutlass was the same kind of car as the Sierra, i.e. smaller than midsize but bigger than compact. No ambitions of sportiness. Simple, comfortable transportation. It even had the same engine as the outgoing Sierra, the 3.1 litre 60-degree V6. In fact, the N-body Cutlass had almost identical dimensions to the A-body Sierra. On the other hand, the new Buick Century was larger than the previous one. The size factor could have been a drawcard for people who wanted the same kind of car as the old A-bodies, but didn't want anything bigger or smaller. It's also worth mentioning that Buick discontinued their N-body Skylark after 1998, meaning GM had no luxury compacts anymore. The N-body Cutlass could have easily filled that gap by offering buyers a well-appointed, traditional, upscale, small car. Now, one might argue that offering two different cars on the same platform would be a bit silly. However, Buick offered the Century and the Regal on the same platform, and it worked well for them. So, Oldsmobile could have offered both the Alero and the Cutlass to appeal to two different market segments. The Alero for those who wanted a sporty, compact sedan or coupe, the Cutlass for those who wanted a more traditional, upmarket family sedan. Unfortunately, the 1997 Cutlass turned out to be just a well-optioned Malibu with a different badge. It wasn't even sold in Canada. In fact, it couldn't be. GM's dealership system there meant that Chevy and Olds were always grouped together, and the new Cutlass was way too similar to the Malibu to sit on the same dealer lots. The Silhouette and Bravada also weren't offered on the Canadian market initially, for the same reason. However, the second-gen Silhouette and third-gen Bravada were introduced north of the border because they were finally different enough from the base Chevys. So with a few more changes, Oldsmobile's N-body Cutlass could have been offered there too, and it probably would have done well. Canadians generally prefer smaller vehicles than Americans, and they tend to buy higher trim levels or more upmarket models, which is why Pontiac often outsold Chevrolet there, and why Acura offered compact models in Canada that they didn't offer in the States. If the Cutlass had been offered in Canada, it might have even outsold the Malibu. Now's probably a good time to talk about the changes it needed. There was so much more that Oldsmobile could have done to give the Cutlass its own identity. First of all, the name was a bad choice. For 1996, the Cutlass Sierra was officially just called the Sierra. So why call the 1997 model the Cutlass? That was just confusing, especially since the Cutlass Supreme was still on the market. Besides, the Cutlass Sierra was often informally referred to as the Sierra, since there was always another Oldsmobile model with the Cutlass name. They really should have called this new car the Sierra, sticking with a familiar name. I'll still refer to it as a Cutlass for the rest of this video though, to avoid confusion. Next, the exterior design obviously needed work. Oldsmobile could have easily made it much more than just a Malibu with a split grille and different taillights. I reckon they did a pretty good job with the taillights, to be fair. I think it looks quite different from the Chevy. That joining line between the housings reminds me of the 88 and 98. I think they should have done something similar with the Alero and Intrigue, but I digress. I'm not sure why they went with red turn signals though. They're already separate lights, and the rest of Oldsmobile's lineup all used amber. The rest of the body isn't so polished. The grille's okay, but it shouldn't have used the same headlights as the Malibu. Different bumper designs would have gone a long way too. It did have more chrome than the Chev, but maybe it needed a little more. One thing the Cutlass definitely needed was a different interior design. The only differences were on the dashboard. It even used the same steering wheel as the Malibu, just with an Olds badge. It really could have used the wheel from the Alero, or maybe the 88. Also, the door cards, center console, dashboard, and seats needed to be more different. One final touch would have been a bench seat. The outgoing Sierra only had a bench seat in its later years, and so did the new W-body Buick Century. And let's not forget Cadillacs, other Buicks and Oldsmobiles, as well as Ford's Panther platform. No matter what people say about the old-fashioned bench seat, at the time it was still somewhat popular for American cars, so the N-body Cutlass needed one to appeal to the Sierra's customer base, at least as an option. Finally, there is one other possible choice that Oldsmobile had. Instead of releasing the N-body Cutlass, or Sierra as mentioned earlier, they could have done what Buick did and develop a more traditional version of the Intrigue, offering a Cutlass Sierra and a Cutlass Supreme on the same platform, assuming they kept the Intrigue's original name. To differentiate the two, the Sierra version could have had a split grille like the Silhouette, Bravada and 88, and maybe a red bar joining the taillights, just like the N-body Cutlass. And of course, a bench seat, like the Century. Since the Intrigue initially had the 3800, the Sierra version could have had the 3.1, mirroring Buick's W-body models. Once the Intrigue got the new dual overhead cam V6 in 1999, the Sierra could have gotten the 3800 as an option. That way, it could carry on the traditional large car segment after the 88 left the scene, which is another thing Oldsmobile overlooked. The Aurora wasn't going to cut it. Come to think of it, maybe Oldsmobile could have taken both options. Offer an N-body model to follow the Cutlass Sierra, and a W-body model to follow the 88. Naming the lineup might be tricky, but not too hard. Maybe Sierra, Cutlass, Intrigue? I don't know. Unfortunately, Oldsmobile took neither option. In an effort to redefine the brand's image, they came up with confusing new model names, then threw in a generic-looking new logo, and to top it all off, they discontinued long-running models that sold well and didn't provide any genuine successor models to maintain brand loyalty. They threw away the cash cow and thought a luxury flagship would save them. Talk about mismanagement. This was quite possibly the biggest contributing factor to Oldsmobile's untimely demise. The fact that they almost had something there just makes the whole thing even more painful. But on the plus side, at least we don't have to worry about Oldsmobile becoming a characterless crossover brand, like Buick is right now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another video.